The Watcher in the Woods, a solo camper's nightmare. Back in early fall last year, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd been needing some quiet, a break from everything, and nothing made me feel as grounded as being alone out in nature. I chose a secluded spot a few hours away from my place, a clearing by a small creek, surrounded by towering pines and with hardly any cell signal. I'd been there once before with friends, but this time I was ready to experience it alone. Just me, my tent, and the quiet sounds of the forest. I packed light, just enough food for 2 days, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a couple of books, and a small camp stove. As I set up, there was this intense stillness all around. It was peaceful, but, I don't know, there was also this strange, heavy feeling in the air that I tried to brush off as me just being overly aware of my own solitude. My first day went pretty smoothly. I spent most of it exploring the woods, keeping track of where I'd been so I wouldn't get lost. The trees were dense, with a thick carpet of leaves, and not a sound except the occasional rustling of squirrels or the croak of a distant raven. As dusk started to settle in, I made my way back to my campsite. I was feeling a little jumpy by then, just that vague unease that sometimes creeps up when you're far from other people. When I got back to my tent, though, I noticed something odd. A small arrangement of twigs, almost like a crude little star, right next to my tent. At first, I thought I'd done it absent-mindedly earlier in the day, but I didn't remember ever touching any sticks around my tent. I laughed it off, convincing myself I was overthinking it, and pushed it aside, trying to settle down for the night. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. Every little sound outside felt amplified, echoing in the darkness. I kept telling myself it was just animals moving around or branches swaying in the breeze, but there was this gnawing feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps outside my tent. Not the soft, skittering noises of small animals, but heavier, human-like steps. I held my breath, clutching my flashlight and listening, but after a minute, the sound stopped. I waited tense, for what felt like hours before finally drifting off into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, still rattled from the night before, hoping that daylight would clear away the strange feelings. But right outside, on the ground in front of me, there was another symbol made of twigs. This one was different from the star shape I'd found before. It looked almost like a stick figure with arms and legs stretched out. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd definitely not made this one, and it hadn't been there when I went to sleep. I started to wonder if maybe someone else was out here, just far enough away to be invisible but close enough to be watching. But the campsite was remote, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone else for miles. Still, the thought of someone else out here with me, and marking the ground like that, had me feeling anxious and paranoid. I decided to shake it off and try to make the best of the day, convincing myself that maybe I was overreacting. I hiked out to a nearby ridge with a view over the forest, hoping the familiar scenery would calm my nerves. But I couldn't fully shake that uneasy feeling, like I was being followed. Every now and then, I'd hear a soft crackle behind me, like someone stepping on a branch, but every time I turned, there was no one there. I kept my flashlight and a small pocket knife close, just in case. When I finally got back to the campsite that afternoon, I felt relieved, until I saw that there were now several more twig symbols scattered around the site, each one slightly different, as if someone had been watching and adding to them while I was away. At this point, I knew I couldn't stay another night. But packing up my things, I had the unsettling feeling I was being watched. That's when I saw it, a figure, just on the edge of the tree line, partially hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out much, just the outline of someone standing there, too still to be natural. They were far enough that I couldn't see their face, but close enough that I knew they were looking right at me. My whole body went cold. I raised my flashlight, even though it was still daylight, hoping it would make them back off or at least let me see them better. But they didn't move, didn't even flinch. They just kept standing there, watching. That was it. I threw everything haphazardly into my bag and didn't even bother collapsing my tent. I just wanted out. I started down the narrow trail that led back to the main road, my heart racing with each step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure trailing me, but the woods were silent, eerily so, as if every creature had gone quiet. The path felt different, unfamiliar, like I'd walked into a place where I didn't belong. I stumbled once or twice, my mind playing tricks on me, convinced that any shadow or rustle was something, coming up behind me. After what felt like an eternity, I finally made it back to the dirt road where I'd parked, and I've never been so relieved to see my car. But as I reached for the door handle, I noticed one last thing that made my stomach drop, another twig figure wedged into the car's windshield wiper. I didn't even stop to examine it. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know who or what was out there with me, or how they got so close without making a sound. I haven't been camping alone since, and to be honest, I'm not sure I'll ever feel comfortable going back into the woods again. The memory of those twig symbols and that still, watching figure at the edge of the trees has stayed with me, haunting me. I wonder sometimes if it was just someone playing a twisted prank, but deep down, I know it felt like something else, something that wasn't interested in letting me go. The lure at the window. I checked into a roadside motel after hours of driving through endless stretches of nothing. It was the kind of place where you barely expect a reception desk, just a Dropbox for keys and a flickering neon sign that somehow looks sadder than inviting. I was exhausted, the kind of tired that makes you feel like you're running on fumes, and all I wanted was a bed, a locked door, and maybe a shower. The room smelled stale, like cigarettes and dust, but it felt like a sanctuary after being on the road for so long. I kicked off my shoes, dropped my bag, and lay on the bed, already half asleep. Sometime past midnight, I was jolted awake by a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was the heating system clanking or maybe the pipes groaning, but then I heard it again, clear, rhythmic knocks against the window. My stomach tightened immediately. This room was on the second floor, and there wasn't any balcony or easy access outside. Still, I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just my half-asleep brain making things up. But when I heard the knock a third time, louder and more deliberate, I got up and walked cautiously toward the window, every instinct in me telling me not to look, but I couldn't resist. As I pulled back the thin curtain, I saw a young boy standing outside, looking directly at me through the glass. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, wearing an oversized hoodie that made him look even smaller. His face was pale, almost ghostly under the dim glow of the motel's parking lot light. He just stood there, expressionless, and for a split second, I wondered if he was some kind of prank or maybe even a lost kid looking for his family. But something about his stillness felt off. He didn't move, didn't fidget, just stared straight at me, his eyes blank and wide. I wanted to look away, but I was frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then he raised a small hand and knocked again, this time with a force that startled me. I stumbled back a step, my heart pounding in my chest. I noticed that his hand was pressed against the glass a little too hard, his knuckles white as he knocked, like he was putting everything he had into those small taps. It felt unnatural, like he wasn't trying to get my attention, but waiting for something. I wanted to ask him if he needed help, but something in my gut warned me to stay silent, to keep the window closed. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of pressure that made the hairs on my arms stand up. That's when I realized I couldn't hear anything outside. No hum from the parking lot lights, no crickets, just complete silence. I kept staring at the boy, trying to figure out what to do. Every rational part of me said to turn away, maybe even call the front desk, if this place even had anyone on duty. But my curiosity got the better of me. I leaned closer to the glass, and that's when I noticed something strange about his face. His skin looked almost translucent, and his eyes, they were darker than they should have been, like there was no light reflecting in them. I could feel my pulse racing, my instincts screaming at me to back away, but it was like I was in some kind of trance, caught in his stare. I lifted a hand, almost as if I was going to open the window, and he tilted his head slightly, like he was waiting for me to do exactly that. Right then, I caught a glimpse of something behind him, a dark figure shifting in the shadows just out of the glow from the parking light. My stomach dropped. It was hard to make out any details, but I could see enough to know that whatever it was tall, much taller than the boy, and it seemed to be watching us. I felt an intense wave of dread as I realized that maybe the boy wasn't alone, and worse, that he was deliberately keeping me distracted. The way he stood, blocking my line of sight with his small frame, suddenly felt deliberate, like he wanted to keep my attention focused on him. My heart pounded as I backed away from the window, hoping that whatever was out there would just go away. As I took a step back, the boy's expression changed for the first time. He smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that seemed out of place on his face. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, that didn't belong to a kid his age. My blood ran cold as I watched him lift one finger, slowly pressing it to his lips in a shove motion. I felt paralyzed, my mind racing through every possible reason for what I was seeing. It felt like he was warning me, or maybe warning someone else. I forced myself to look past him, hoping to get a better look at whatever was lurking in the shadows, but the dark figure had vanished. Just as I thought it was over, I heard a faint scratching noise coming from my door. My heart felt like it might explode as I whipped my head toward the sound, half expecting to see someone trying to break in. But the door was closed, the deadbolt still in place. I glanced back at the window, but the boy was gone too. It was like he'd never been there, like everything I'd seen was some twisted dream. But the scratching at the door continued, soft but deliberate, and now I could feel the vibrations of it through the floor, like something, or someone, was desperately trying to find a way in. I held my breath, inching closer to the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. I leaned in, just barely close enough to peek through the peephole, and for a second, I thought I saw movement. A quick blur, like someone stepping out of view. I stepped back, not sure if I could handle what I might see if I looked again. The scratching had stopped, replaced by a faint whispering sound, like someone was just outside, speaking too softly for me to understand. I strained to hear, pressing my ear to the door, but it was just out of reach. The words sounded garbled, unnatural, like a bad recording playing on a loop. Suddenly, there was a single, heavy knock on the door. I jumped back, stumbling as my foot caught on the edge of the carpet. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I don't know why, but I felt like if I opened that door, something terrible would happen. Something I couldn't undo. I backed up until I hit the wall, sinking down and pressing my knees to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. I kept my eyes locked on the door, convinced that if I blinked, I'd miss something creeping in. After a few seconds of silence, I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, fading down the hall, each step echoing like it was meant to leave a mark in my memory. I sat there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, just listening to the silence that had returned to the room. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was some kind of weird prank, or maybe I'd imagined it all out of exhaustion. But the lingering feeling of dread wouldn't leave me. It was as if the air was still charged with something wrong. Finally, gathering what little courage I had left, I stood up and walked to the door, half expecting to hear the scratching or whispering start up again. But it was dead quiet. I looked through the peephole once more. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway stretching out in both directions, empty. Just when I thought I might be safe, I heard a soft tap against the window again. My heart sank. I turned slowly, feeling my skin crawl as I approached the window. This time, though, when I peeked out, there was no boy. Instead, I saw a handprint smudged on the glass, faint but unmistakable, right at eye level. It was larger than the boy's hand would have been, almost adult-sized, but distorted, like the fingers were too long, too thin. I stared at it, frozen, and then I noticed a faint trail of those smudged handprints leading away from my window, stretching out into the darkness beyond the parking lot, as if whatever had been there wanted me to follow. I knew I should just leave it alone, lock the door, and wait for morning. But something about those handprints drew me in, a mix of fear and an almost irrational curiosity. Against my better judgment, I found myself stepping outside, shivering as the cold night air hit me. The parking lot was empty, quiet, with just the distant hum of the highway cutting through the silence. I looked down and saw those smudged handprints leading around the side of the building, fading as they reached the gravel. I kept telling myself that I'd turn back, that I'd go inside and forget about it, but my legs seemed to move on their own, like I was being pulled toward something. As I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the dim light, was the same figure I'd seen earlier behind the boy. Only now, there was no mistaking its shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles, like a broken marionette. Its face, or what should have been a face, was obscured by darkness, but I could feel it watching me, feel its gaze crawling over my skin. A wave of nausea washed over me as I realized that it had been waiting for me all along, that maybe the boy was just a lure to get me outside, alone in the open. My instincts finally kicked in, and I turned to run back to my room, but the motel suddenly felt far too quiet, like I was trapped in a void. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. As I finally managed to unlock the door and slip inside, I slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt. My heart was racing, and every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floor, the hum of the old heating unit, my own uneven breathing. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, but deep down, I knew that thin wooden door wouldn't be enough to keep whatever that thing was out. As I sat on the floor, trying to make sense of what just happened, I heard that soft, familiar tapping on the window again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I peeked out from the edge of the curtain, and there he was, the boy, standing there as if he'd never left. He wasn't knocking this time. He was just staring, his empty eyes fixed right on me. That same eerie smile crept across his face, and I realized then that he wasn't a lost child, wasn't even something human. I don't know how long I stared back, too terrified to move, but after a few seconds, he pressed his finger to his lips again, as if reminding me to stay silent, as if this whole thing had been some kind of sick game. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned away from the window, grabbed my bag, and bolted. I didn't care about checkout or my things. I just needed to get out of that place. As I sped down the hallway, I could feel something behind me, like I was being watched, or worse, followed. Every shadow seemed to stretch and warp, and each corner felt like it hid something waiting to leap out. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled to unlock the door, throwing myself inside and locking it, half expecting to see that boy in the rearview mirror, still grinning at me. But when I looked up, the parking lot was empty, as if I'd imagined everything. I didn't wait to find out. I started the engine and tore out of there, my hands still shaking on the wheel. Even after I was miles away, the dread lingered, like an invisible weight pressing on my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, watching me from the dark corners of my mind. When I finally pulled into a rest stop to catch my breath, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine, a small, faint handprint on the outside of my driver's side window. It looked fresh, smeared slightly, as though a child had just pressed their hand against the glass. I didn't know what to think. I don't know what that boy was, or what that figure in the shadows wanted. But I haven't been able to sleep properly since that night, and every time I close my eyes, I swear I can still hear that faint tapping, waiting for me to look. Shadows on the midnight walk. It happened a few weeks ago, but it's still fresh in my mind, like it happened just last night. I'd been working late at the office again, and by the time I finally clocked out, it was close to midnight. The streets were dead quiet. the kind of quiet that makes you more aware of every little sound. I didn't have my car that night, so I was walking home alone, cutting through a few empty side streets to save time. Usually, I don't mind the walk. It gives me a chance to clear my head after a long day. But from the moment I stepped onto that first dark street, something felt off. It was this creeping feeling, like someone was just a few steps behind me, watching. I brushed it off at first, blaming my own paranoia. It was late, and I was probably just tired. But after a few minutes, I started hearing it, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle of footsteps. They stopped when I stopped, almost like they were mimicking my every move. I told myself it could just be someone else heading home, so I kept walking, quickening my pace just a bit. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Every step I took, I felt like I was being pulled deeper into something bad, something I didn't want to find out about. The footsteps continued, staying just close enough to make me feel that unmistakable chill down my spine. That's when I made up my mind. I had to know if someone was really there. I stopped suddenly and turned around, half expecting to see an empty street behind me, like maybe it was all in my head. But no, there was someone there, standing just within the glow of a flickering streetlight about 20 feet back. It was a man, tall and thin, with his head tilted slightly downward so I couldn't see his face clearly. He just stood there, watching me, his posture weirdly stiff, almost unnatural. I froze, feeling my stomach twist with a mix of fear and confusion. I thought about calling out, but my throat felt dry, like something was stopping me from making a sound. I didn't know what else to do, so I just turned back around and kept walking, faster this time, hoping he'd stay where he was. But the footsteps started up again, louder this time, like he was matching my pace. My mind raced, trying to remember if I'd seen him somewhere before, maybe someone I'd passed on my way out of the office. But nothing about him was familiar. I could feel his eyes on me, and with every step, the space between us seemed to shrink, no matter how fast I tried to walk. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I wanted to run, but I was too scared that it would make him chase me. I kept telling myself, just get to a main road, find somewhere with lights or people. But somehow, every corner I turned seemed darker than the last, like I was getting further away from any safe place. I finally couldn't take it anymore. I took a deep breath and turned around again, hoping maybe he'd stopped following, or better yet, vanished completely. But there he was, even closer this time, only about 10 feet away. His face was still partially hidden by the shadows, but I could make out the slightest smirk on his lips. That smirk, it was like he knew exactly how scared I was, like he was enjoying every second of it. I forced myself to speak, barely managing to get the words out. "Are you following me?" My voice sounded shaky, pathetic, but I didn't care. He didn't respond, just kept staring with that same twisted look, tilting his head slowly, like he was studying me. At that point, my instincts kicked in. I turned and bolted, breaking into a full sprint down the street. I could hear his footsteps pick up behind me, the heavy thud of his shoes hitting the pavement. It felt like he was getting closer, every step making my heart hammer faster. My lungs were burning, my legs starting to ache, but I couldn't slow down. I kept my eyes fixed on the end of the block, hoping desperately that I'd see a car passing by or even a single light in a window. But everything was dead still, as if the whole city had gone silent just for this nightmare. I could feel him gaining on me, his footsteps practically in sync with mine. Just as I reached the end of the block, I spotted an alleyway to my left. It was narrow and dark, but at that moment, it felt like my only chance to lose him. Without thinking, I darted into the alley and pressed myself against the wall, trying to catch my breath as quietly as possible. I could hear his footsteps slow down as he reached the mouth of the alley, just a few feet from where I was hiding. I held my breath, heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. After a few seconds, I dared to peek around the corner, hoping he'd lost interest. But there he was, standing right at the edge of the alley, his eyes scanning the shadows. His face was clearer now under the dim light, and what I saw made my stomach drop. He looked wrong, like there was something off about his face, like he didn't quite belong. His skin looked too pale, almost gray, and his eyes seemed unnaturally wide, glinting in the dark with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He took a slow step forward, then another, his gaze locked in my direction, as if he could sense I was there. I pressed myself harder against the wall, trying to disappear into the concrete, praying he wouldn't come any closer. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, as he seemed to search for me with those strange, almost inhuman eyes. Then, without warning, he stopped, let out a slow, shallow breath, and turned back the way he'd come, disappearing down the street as silently as he'd appeared. I waited there, pressed against the wall, not daring to move or breathe until I was absolutely certain he was gone. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I'd collapse right there in the alley. After what felt like forever, I peeked out, scanning the street, desperate to make sure he wasn't lurking around the corner. Everything was silent and empty, but the fear still pulsed in my veins, like he might come back any second. I forced myself to step out of the alley and onto the main street, feeling exposed and vulnerable, but I needed to get home as fast as possible. I kept glancing back, convinced I'd see him standing under one of the streetlights, that eerie smirk on his face, but each time, the street was empty. Finally, I reached my building, fumbling with my keys, my hand shaking so much it took 3 tries to unlock the door. I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me and double-locking it. For a long time, I just stood there, breathing heavily, my mind replaying the entire experience, trying to make sense of what happened. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? Some guy followed me and disappeared? It sounded insane, like I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, and that look in his eyes still haunts me every time I think about it. Since that night, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, even when I'm alone. And sometimes, when I walk home late, I swear I hear those footsteps again, just a few steps behind me. The Watcher on the Road. I was on a solo road trip across the Midwest, something I'd been planning for years. I wanted the open roads, cheap motels, and the quiet that comes with being out in the middle of nowhere. It was early fall, right when the leaves were starting to turn, and there was this cool, crisp feeling in the air. Most days, I'd drive until sunset, then find some small-town diner to eat, jot down my thoughts, and make a loose plan for the next day. I wasn't exactly following a map, just letting the roads lead me wherever they felt like going. I felt free, and in some ways, even a little invincible, like this trip was exactly what I'd needed. But that night, something shifted. I'd pulled into this old diner off Highway 70. The sign was flickering, casting this orange glow across the empty lot, and the place looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. There was a waitress who barely looked at me when I walked in, just waved me to a booth by the window. The place was nearly empty except for a man seated a few booths away, leaning back with his coffee. He looked unremarkable at first, worn baseball cap, flannel shirt, but something about him was immediately unsettling. Maybe it was how he was watching me, his gaze barely breaking even when I glanced over, like he'd been waiting for me to show up. I tried to shake off the weird feeling and focus on my food. The whole point of this trip was to get out of my head, to stop overthinking every little thing. But each time I looked up, he was still there, that same blank look on his face. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, that he was just a lonely guy with nothing better to do than people watch. But then, as the waitress refilled my coffee, he slid out of his booth and walked over. Without asking, he sat down right across from me, his eyes not leaving mine as he took a sip from his mug, as if we'd been meeting there on purpose. The first thing he said made my skin crawl. "Long drive, huh? You must be tired after hitting all those little towns." I just stared, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. How did he know I'd been stopping in small towns? My itinerary wasn't planned or posted anywhere. I'd only made my decisions as I went. He continued talking in this calm, almost friendly tone, rattling off the names of towns I'd been to in exact order, like he'd been tracking my whole route. It was bizarre and terrifying how he knew these specific details, down to the gas station where I'd stopped that morning for coffee. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as he kept talking, weaving in these little details about my trip that no one else could know. He even mentioned the playlist I'd been listening to, specific songs I'd played on repeat, and I felt my stomach twist. My hands were sweaty around my coffee cup, and I was fighting the urge to just get up and leave, but something in his gaze pinned me down, like he was daring me to react. Every word he said felt like it had weight, like he was revealing just enough to let me know how closely he'd been watching, without giving away why he was doing it. Then, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You really should have taken that turn back at Clyde," he said, almost casually, his lips curling into a smirk. "The way you went takes you through some pretty lonely stretches." The air seemed to go out of the room as he said that. I hadn't told anyone about my plan to take the back roads. That route was something I'd only considered earlier that morning, after feeling like I'd seen too many tourists at the main stops. Somehow, he knew even that tiny detail, and it was like he'd been right there beside me the whole time, invisible and watching. My mind was racing, trying to find some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. He couldn't have just guessed all of it. He had to have followed me. But then how? I'd been all over, taking random turns, staying in different towns each night. My phone was off most of the time, and I hadn't posted anything online. I could feel myself shrinking back in the booth, suddenly very aware of how isolated we were in that diner. Even the waitress had disappeared into the kitchen, leaving just the two of us. I thought about making a break for it, but my legs felt like lead. I was terrified he'd stop me before I even got out the door. Then, as if sensing my thoughts, he said, "It's not like I'd let anything happen to you." He paused, staring at me in a way that felt disturbingly personal. "Not after all this time." That phrase, "after all this time," sent chills down my spine. I searched his face, looking for some sign that maybe he was just messing with me, some hint of a joke, but he was dead serious. His expression was calm, steady, almost like he was talking to an old friend. The weirdest part was that he seemed hurt, like I'd somehow wronged him by not recognizing him. But I was certain I'd never seen him before in my life. I finally managed to stammer out a question. "Do I know you?" My voice sounded small, and I hated how vulnerable I felt asking it, but I had to know. He leaned back, studying me with this strange, almost disappointed look, as if he'd been waiting for me to remember something I'd forgotten. "You could say that," he replied slowly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his coffee mug. "We've crossed paths more than you'd think." His voice was calm, but there was something cold underneath it, like he held some grudge or some expectation that I'd failed to meet. He didn't explain further, just kept watching me with those steady eyes that seemed to see right through me. I felt trapped, like every move I made was under his control. The urge to get up, to just bolt, was growing stronger, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Finally, he stood up, keeping his gaze on me the entire time. For a moment, I thought he was going to leave, and relief washed over me. But instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, sliding it across the table toward me. "Next time," he said, his tone almost gentle, "try sticking to the main roads." Then, without another word, he walked out, leaving me alone in the silent diner, staring down at that slip of paper like it was a ticking bomb. My hands were shaking as I picked up the paper, half expecting some cryptic message, maybe an address or a threat. But it was something worse. Much worse. It was a list, written in cramped, precise handwriting. Every town I'd stopped in, every motel, every diner. Dates, times, even the gas stations. It was all there, every detail of my trip in perfect order, down to the hours I'd spent in each place. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest. I kept looking around, half expecting him to walk back in or to find someone watching from the kitchen, but the diner was silent, as if time had frozen the moment he left. I dropped the paper on the table like it was burning me and bolted out of the booth. Outside, the night air felt harsh and cold, the kind that cuts through you and makes it hard to breathe. My car was the only one in the lot, which somehow made it worse, like he'd been the only other person here, a ghost who'd slipped away into the darkness. As I fumbled for my keys, I glanced around, convinced he'd be watching from somewhere, waiting to see my reaction. But the lot was empty. I jumped in the car, locked the doors, and sped out of there without looking back, the lights of the diner shrinking in my rearview mirror until they vanished completely. I drove for miles, gripping the wheel so tightly my hands were cramping, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who was that man? How had he known so much about me? And how long had he been following me, watching me in all those places where I'd felt alone and safe? I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his headlights following me, but the road stayed empty. At some point, I had to pull over, my head spinning, my body exhausted. I could barely make sense of what had happened back there, yet every detail of that night felt etched into my mind, impossible to shake. After what felt like hours, I finally convinced myself to look at the paper again. I unfolded it slowly, almost hoping it had changed somehow, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But the list was still there, as precise and unnerving as before. And at the bottom, a note I hadn't noticed earlier: "See you soon." The handwriting was small but clear, and that single line felt more sinister than all the details combined. The words were a promise, a warning that whatever this was, it wasn't over. My hands went cold, and in that moment, I realized that my trip, my so-called escape, was no longer mine at all. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, not without answers. I debated driving to the nearest police station, but what would I even tell them? Some stranger had left me a list of places I'd visited, places anyone could find out about if they were determined enough. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some harmless prank or coincidence. The way he'd looked at me, the way he knew things no one else could, felt too personal, too intentional. I decided to cut my trip short. Whatever freedom or peace I'd been searching for out here had vanished the moment he'd sat down across from me in that diner. That night, I drove straight back home, barely stopping until I was back in my driveway. But even now, safe in my own space, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching. I haven't gone on another road trip since. Some days, I find myself checking my rearview mirror more often than I should, convinced that I'll see him there, following me again. The note he left still haunts me. "See you soon." I don't know if he'll ever show up again, but that phrase left a mark that I don't think will ever fade. It's like he took a piece of my peace of mind, and I've come to realize that I may never truly get it back. The Silent Stalker. I went to see a movie by myself last Friday. It was one of those days when I just needed a break, and the theater felt like the perfect escape. I got my popcorn, picked a seat somewhere in the middle, and settled in, feeling that rare comfort of being alone in a dark room, surrounded by strangers, all lost in their own little worlds. About halfway through the previews, I noticed a guy sitting a few rows behind me. Nothing strange about it. He was just another moviegoer, probably also there to enjoy a night off. But something about him made me glance back a couple of times. Maybe it was his posture, or the way he seemed fixated on the empty screen, not moving at all. But at that point, I shrugged it off. The movie started, and I got absorbed into the story. Every now and then, though, I'd look around, just out of habit. I glanced back and noticed that the guy had moved up a few rows. Now, he was sitting maybe 4 rows behind me, and for some reason, that pulled me out of the film. It felt odd. Most people either stayed in their seats or moved to a whole different section if they weren't comfortable. But this guy had just scooted closer. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself he just wanted a better view or something. Still, it unsettled me enough that I found myself checking over my shoulder more than I usually would. I tried to focus on the movie, telling myself I was being paranoid, but something made me look back again. Now, he was just 2 rows behind me. He was leaning forward slightly, like he was trying to get a better look at something, or maybe someone. I felt this weird, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, and my stomach twisted. There was no logical reason for him to keep changing seats like that, and he was moving closer each time. I started to wonder if I should just move or maybe even leave, but I didn't want to look like a total weirdo fleeing over nothing. About 10 minutes later, I couldn't help myself. I glanced back again. This time, he was in the row directly behind me, and he was staring straight at me, not even pretending to watch the movie. His eyes were fixed, wide, and intense, like he was studying me. My heart started pounding. I thought about getting up right then, but I was frozen, as if moving would trigger something I didn't want to find out about. I just sat there, my palms sweaty, trying to breathe normally, trying to convince myself he'd look away or go back to his seat if I ignored him. But he didn't look away. I forced myself to focus on the screen, hoping he'd lose interest. But I could feel him there, just inches behind me. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. I leaned forward, pretending to stretch, and stole a quick glance behind me. He'd moved again. This time, he was sitting in the seat right beside mine. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I hadn't heard him get up or sit down, and the theater was dead silent except for the movie playing. I could feel his arm resting close to mine, almost touching. My throat went dry, and my heart was racing so loud I could barely think. All I could manage was to stay still, gripping the armrests, hoping I was just imagining things. Then he leaned in close, so close that I could feel his breath against my ear. And in the softest, most chilling whisper, he said, "I knew you'd come alone." My entire body went cold. I couldn't process what I just heard, but something in the way he said it made my skin crawl, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. I stood up so fast that my chair creaked loudly, and a few people in the back row turned to look. I didn't care. I mumbled an excuse under my breath, not even sure if he could hear me, and stumbled down the aisle, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. I hurried out of the theater, practically tripping over my own feet, and didn't look back. The lobby was almost empty, and the silence felt surreal compared to the chaos in my mind. I glanced over my shoulder just once, praying he hadn't followed me. I didn't see him, but the unease wouldn't leave. I went straight to the restroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to shake off that horrible whisper. "I knew you'd come alone." Those words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't stop replaying his creepy, breathy tone, like he'd been savoring every syllable. I stood there, gripping the sink, wondering if I was just overreacting. But no, I could still feel that intense, unsettling gaze as if he were right behind me. After a few minutes, I stepped back into the lobby, intending to just leave and forget the whole night. But as I turned the corner toward the exit, my heart dropped. He was there, standing in the middle of the lobby, looking right at me. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stared, with a faint smile that made my skin crawl. It was like he knew exactly what I was feeling, like he enjoyed seeing me terrified. I quickly turned, making a beeline for the exit, barely able to breathe until I reached the outside doors. Even then, I didn't feel safe until I was locked inside my car, gripping the steering wheel with shaking hands, watching the entrance to see if he'd follow me out. But he never did. I sat in my car for what felt like ages, staring at the theater doors. Part of me expected him to come striding out, maybe even waving, as if this was all some sick joke. But he didn't appear. Finally, I took a deep breath and started my car, telling myself that the worst was over, that I was probably just overreacting. But that didn't stop my hands from shaking as I drove away. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, paranoid that I'd see him somehow, following me on foot or in another car. But there was nothing, just empty streets and the quiet hum of my car engine. By the time I got home, I'd managed to calm down a bit, though the entire experience still lingered like a bad taste. I tried to tell myself that maybe it had just been a coincidence, that maybe he hadn't even meant anything by it. But late that night, when I was finally trying to get some sleep, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It read, "Hope you enjoyed the movie. Can't wait to see you again." My blood ran cold, and I stared at the screen in disbelief, too scared to move, too stunned to even think straight. I have no idea how he got my number or if he's still out there waiting. But since that night, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, and every little sound in the dark keeps me wide awake, terrified he'll show up again. The caretaker's warning. I had heard about this old church on the edge of town, long abandoned and supposedly forgotten by everyone except a few locals who still told stories about it. I'm a freelance photographer, and I love capturing places that have a bit of history and mystery. So, one foggy afternoon, I drove out there alone, with just my camera and a flashlight. The church was way off the main road, surrounded by thick woods. By the time I parked my car and walked up the crumbling stone steps, there was an eerie silence that I didn't expect. No birds, no wind, just this thick, unnatural quiet that put me on edge before I even stepped inside. But I tried to brush it off as my imagination. Inside, it was worse than I anticipated. The ceiling had partially caved in, letting in patches of weak, gray light. Old, broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and there was this damp smell, like mold and something stale. I started snapping photos, adjusting my camera to capture the shadows and decayed details. The place had this strange energy, like it was watching me back. I felt chills run up my arms, but I kept shooting, telling myself it was just an old building. Then, as I was looking through my lens to get a close-up of some old carvings on the wall, I noticed a figure standing at the far end of the aisle. It looked like a man, dressed in dark, worn-out clothes, just staring at me from the shadows. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I froze, my heart pounding as I lowered the camera and squinted to get a better look. He looked older, his face shadowed under a worn, wide-brimmed hat, and his clothes seemed out of place, almost like he'd stepped out of another era. I forced myself to take a breath and managed to say, "Hey, sorry if I'm trespassing. I didn't think anyone would be here." He didn't move or respond for a few seconds that felt like hours. Then finally he said, in this raspy, low voice, "I'm the caretaker here. You shouldn't be here. You need to leave." His words hit me harder than they should have, like he was stating a fact, not a suggestion. And for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was dead serious. Despite his warning, something in me wanted to stay and capture the church. It felt like one of those once-in-a-lifetime shots that I couldn't just walk away from. So I tried to play it cool and asked, "Mind if I just take a few more pictures?" "I'll be quick, I promise." He didn't answer, just stood there, watching me. There was this emptiness in his eyes that made my skin crawl. Eventually, he nodded, almost reluctantly, but I didn't feel any relief. Instead, I felt a sudden weight in the air, almost like the church itself was closing in on me. I knew I shouldn't have ignored his warning, but I turned back to my camera, determined to finish what I came for. As I lifted the camera again, I felt this intense pressure, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. Every instinct was telling me to turn around, but I forced myself to focus on the shot. Just as I clicked the shutter, I heard him say again, in that same gravelly tone, "You really should leave." This time, his voice sounded closer, almost like he'd moved up the aisle without me even hearing it. I spun around, but he hadn't moved. He was still standing at the far end, but now there was a strange look on his face, something between anger and pity maybe. It made me feel small, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be seeing. Then, out of nowhere, I started to feel dizzy. It was like the room itself was shifting, the walls stretching and contracting, making me feel disoriented. I stumbled backward, gripping my camera for balance, and that's when I noticed something else. There were strange symbols carved into the walls, ones I hadn't seen before. They looked almost fresh, like they'd been cut recently, deep into the stone. I pointed my flashlight at them, trying to make sense of the shapes, but they just made me feel more nauseous. That's when I felt a chill run through me, colder than anything I'd felt before, like the air itself had turned to ice. I heard him say one last time, now in a whisper, "Leave while you still can." I didn't need to be told again. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my bag and turned to head for the door, but somehow the way out seemed farther than before. It felt like I was moving in slow motion, the walls closing in around me. As I passed by the pews, I caught glimpses of shadows moving just out of sight, like something was following me, staying hidden but close enough that I could feel it. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing loudly, and tried not to look back. But just before I reached the door, I couldn't resist. I had to know if he was still there. I turned, expecting to see him watching me from the shadows. But he was gone. The entire church was empty, eerily silent, as if no one had been there in years. My skin prickled as I took in the scene, everything looking exactly as it had when I first entered, except now there was a strange, heavy silence, even thicker than before. I couldn't explain it, but I knew, deep down, that I'd overstayed my welcome. I rushed outside, and as soon as I stepped back into the daylight, the dizziness lifted, the pressure on my chest eased, and I could finally breathe again. But when I looked back at the church from the safety of the road, it looked different, somehow darker, as if it was watching me leave. As I made my way back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man, or whatever he was, coming after me. But the forest around me was empty, still as a graveyard. When I reached my car, I threw my camera bag into the passenger seat, jumped in, and locked the doors, my heart still racing. I sat there for a minute, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that I'd just let my imagination get the best of me. But as I looked down at my camera, I decided to check the shots. I thought maybe I could make some sense of what I'd seen. But when I reviewed the photos, my blood ran cold. In each shot where the man should have been standing, there was nothing, just empty shadows. And in one of the photos, where I'd focused on the carvings in the stone, there was a dark shape in the background, almost like a shadow, but with a distorted face. It wasn't the man I'd seen, but it looked human, or close to human. The eyes were dark, hollow, staring straight at me through the lens. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was alone in the car in broad daylight, but that single image made me feel like I was still back inside that church, like it had somehow followed me out. I didn't even think. I just deleted every photo I'd taken, one by one, wanting to erase any trace of that place. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be that easy, that somehow I'd still brought something back with me. As I sat there, deleting the last image, I glanced up at the church one last time through the windshield, almost daring myself to go back in and prove that none of it was real. But as I stared, I saw something that made my heart skip, a figure, just barely visible through one of the broken windows, standing there, watching me. It looked like the caretaker, just a shadow against the glass, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold and heavy. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. I slammed my car into gear and sped off, my mind racing, replaying everything I'd just experienced. Part of me still wondered if I'd imagined it all, if maybe it was just the isolation and the silence that had gotten to me. But when I got home, I couldn't shake the sense of dread that followed me, lingering in the back of my mind. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadowed face from the photo, staring back at me, as if it was trying to say something. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still feel like something's watching me, just out of sight, waiting in the shadows, as if that place never really let me go. In the days that followed, I tried to forget about it, hoping that pushing it to the back of my mind would make it disappear. But every so often, strange things started happening around my apartment. Lights would flicker even though I just changed the bulbs, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing just outside my bedroom door. I'd tell myself it was just my nerves, that I was still shaken up from the church, but deep down I knew it was more than that. I had this overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone, like something had latched onto me and wouldn't let go. Eventually, I decided to stop taking photos of abandoned places altogether. I sold my camera and avoided even walking near that side of town. But every so often, I still think back to that day, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd listened to the caretaker's warning the first time. Sometimes, I can still feel that same icy chill from the church, like a shadow that's always just behind me, waiting. I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks, or if something really did follow me home that day. All I know is, I haven't set foot in an old building since. And honestly, I don't think I ever will again. The Stranger on the Trail, a hiker's nightmare. I decided to go for a solo hike that day. It was supposed to be a quick out and back on a trail I knew well, tucked into a forest reserve that hardly ever got crowded. I'd started out late morning, thinking I'd be back by early afternoon. Just me, the trees, and my thoughts. About an hour in, I spotted another hiker coming up from behind me, which didn't strike me as odd at first. People hike alone all the time, right? But as he got closer, I noticed he was smiling this huge, overly friendly smile, like he was way too happy to see someone out here. When he finally reached me, he matched his pace to mine, introducing himself like we were on a casual neighborhood stroll, not in the middle of a secluded trail. And I don't know why, but something about him just felt off. At first, I tried to brush it off as just me being paranoid. He seemed friendly, maybe a little overly chatty, but nothing wrong with that, right? But then he started asking personal questions, things that felt way too familiar. So, you're hiking alone, huh? Bet your family back home doesn't know you're out here. My stomach dropped because, how did he know I had family nearby? I hadn't mentioned it, and we were miles away from the closest town. I brushed it off, mumbled something non-committal, but he didn't stop. He asked if I still worked at the same place, mentioning my job title like he'd memorized it. As he kept talking, I felt the unease settle deeper into my gut. He was throwing out little details about my life, things he had no business knowing. He knew the name of my hometown, where I'd gone to school, even mentioned an old friend of mine by name, someone I hadn't talked to in years. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I'd met him before, if he was someone I should recognize, but I was coming up blank. The strangest part was that he kept smiling, like all this was just normal small talk. The more he talked, the more trapped I felt, but I didn't want to let on that I was freaked out. I figured I'd just keep walking, act calm, and eventually, he'd get bored and go on his way. But he didn't. He stayed right next to me, matching my pace exactly, and every time I slowed down or sped up, he'd do the same. I was getting this sick feeling in my stomach like I was being cornered. Finally, I made an excuse, telling him I needed to check something on my phone, hoping he'd take the hint and give me some space. I pulled out my phone, pretending to look at it, but he just leaned in closer, peering over my shoulder. "Battery still good?" he asked, smiling like we were sharing some private joke. I felt a chill go down my spine. How did he know about my battery? I hadn't mentioned it, hadn't looked at it, and yet he somehow knew that my phone was low on charge. At that point, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from him, but we were deep in the trail, far from any exit or other people. I kept my face neutral and gave a weak laugh, trying to hide how rattled I was. Then, without even thinking it through, I told him I was turning back, that I'd forgotten something in my car. He didn't even hesitate. "I'll walk with you," he said, and that strange, too-wide grin never left his face. I tried to keep my cool as we retraced our steps, but I was scanning every inch of the trail, looking for an escape route or any sign of another person. He kept talking as we walked, saying things that were meant to sound friendly but came out unsettling. He started mentioning my schedule, my usual routines, things I'd never shared online or with anyone but close friends. And then he dropped this line, in a casual tone, like it was nothing. "I've always liked how you take the same trail around this time of year. Makes it easy to find you." That was it. I couldn't pretend any longer. I was terrified. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm, not wanting to show him how shaken I was. I slowed my pace slightly, pretending to tie my shoe, all the while plotting my next move. When I straightened up, I noticed a faint side trail off to the left, barely visible through the brush. I made a split-second decision and pointed towards it, saying, "Actually, I think this is a shortcut. It'll get us back quicker." I didn't know if that was true, but I hoped he'd believe me. He paused for a moment, his smile faltering just slightly, as if he was weighing whether to follow. I could tell he was suspicious, but I had no choice. As I turned onto the trail, I picked up my pace, glancing back every so often to see if he was still behind me. At first, I didn't see him, and a wave of relief started to wash over me. But just as I let myself relax, I heard branches snapping, heavy footsteps crashing through the brush. I broke into a full sprint, not caring anymore if I made noise. My lungs were burning, and every step felt like it could be my last. The trail twisted and narrowed, and I could feel him closing in behind me. Just as panic was about to set in fully, I saw an opening through the trees, a small clearing with what looked like another trailhead. I practically threw myself into the clearing, desperately hoping it would lead me closer to the parking lot or somewhere safer. But as I slowed down to catch my breath, I realized it wasn't a proper trailhead at all. It was more like an abandoned area of the park, overgrown and forgotten. There was no clear path, just dense trees and silence. For a moment, I couldn't hear him behind me, and I thought maybe I'd lost him. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching me. That same creepy smile stretched across his face as if he found this all amusing. I froze, and for a few seconds, we just stared at each other, neither of us saying a word. Then, he tilted his head and said, "You know, you're exactly like I pictured. Always so predictable." The way he said it, like he'd been watching me for a long time, made my blood run cold. I couldn't think straight. My mind was reeling. I didn't know if he was just trying to mess with me, or if he genuinely knew things about me that he shouldn't. But I didn't wait to find out. I forced myself to move, scrambling backward and crashing through the underbrush, barely able to see where I was going but knowing I had to get out, no matter what. I pushed through the dense brush, branches scraping my arms and face, barely able to breathe from the panic and exhaustion. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between us. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I'd see. I finally stumbled onto a narrow path, one I vaguely recognized from earlier. I knew this one would lead back to the main trail and, hopefully, towards safety. But just as I started to feel a sliver of relief, I heard him again. His footsteps, slow and steady, following the same path. It was as if he knew every move I'd make before I did. I sped up, practically running now, my legs burning from the effort. The sound of his footsteps was fading, but I didn't stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow still close, still watching. After what felt like forever, I finally spotted the trail marker that led back to the parking lot. My heart leaped with hope, and I pushed myself for one last sprint. As I burst into the clearing near the lot, I half expected him to be there, waiting for me. But there was no sign of him, Just the empty lot, my car sitting right where I'd left it. I scrambled for my keys, threw myself inside, and locked the doors, my hand shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the engine started. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing at the edge of the trail or, worse, following me down the road. But the parking lot and the forest faded into the distance, and eventually I was alone on the highway. My heartbeat was still pounding in my ears, my mind racing with questions. How had he known so much about me? How had he tracked my routine, my life? And what would have happened if I hadn't run? By the time I got home, I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. I wanted to believe it was over, that I was safe. That night, I could barely sleep, every creak and shadow in my room making me jump. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, glancing at the screen now and then just to make sure I hadn't missed a call or a message. But just as I was starting to drift off, my phone buzzed with a notification. My heart stopped when I saw it was from an unknown number. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I opened it. The message was short, just 2 words, "See you." Even now, I have no idea how he got my number or if he was serious. All I know is I haven't hiked alone since that day, and every now and then, I still catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's still out there, watching. Silent Watcher. The notes that followed me. That night, I'd been in the library for hours. It was dead silent, with only a couple of students scattered around, each lost in their books or laptops. I was tucked in a corner on the 3rd floor, surrounded by tall bookshelves that made the place feel like a maze. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered every now and then, adding to the eerie vibe. It was almost midnight, and I'd already downed 2 cups of stale coffee from the vending machine down the hall. I'd gone there to cram for an exam, expecting the quiet to help me focus, but instead, it just made me hyper-aware of every sound. The hum of the lights, the occasional rustling of paper, even my own breathing seemed louder. I was flipping through my notes when I noticed a folded piece of paper on the edge of my desk. At first, I thought maybe I'd dropped it from my notebook, but I hadn't used any loose sheets. I picked it up and unfolded it slowly, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. The note simply said, "You always sit here when you need to concentrate, don't you?" My stomach turned. I hadn't told anyone that I always studied on the 3rd floor, in that exact spot, every time I needed peace and quiet. I looked around, trying to catch sight of whoever might have left it, but the library was practically empty. Everyone was buried in their own work, and no one seemed to be watching me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence or maybe some kind of prank. But the longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable I felt. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me, but all I saw were empty rows of desks and shelves stretching into shadows. After a while, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid and went back to studying, though I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. Maybe 20 minutes passed, and just as I was starting to calm down, I felt something brush against my backpack, like someone had slipped something into the side pocket. My heart was racing as I reached in and pulled out another note, this time folded into a tight square. This one said, "I know you hate math. Maybe you should give it a break." That hit me hard. I'd been struggling with my math course all semester, and only a few close friends knew how stressed it made me. I scanned the room again, more frantic this time, hoping to see someone. A familiar face, a hint of a joke, but there was no one there who could have done it. The room felt colder, and every sound seemed amplified. The only explanation I could come up with was that someone had been watching me for a while, close enough to know things that I hadn't shared with anyone besides my friends. I felt exposed, like the walls had eyes, and I couldn't escape that unsettling feeling that I was no longer alone. I tried to pack up my things as quietly as possible, deciding I'd had enough studying for the night. But as I started gathering my notebooks, another note slipped out from under my laptop. My hands shook as I unfolded it. This one read, "Leaving so soon?" Midnight is your usual time, isn't it? It took everything in me not to just run right then and there. Someone knew not only where I studied, but also my routine, down to the times I'd usually stay. It was like they were tracking me every time I came here. I glanced around, desperate to see anyone who looked even remotely suspicious, but there was no one. Just students lost in their books, oblivious to the panic rising in me. I forced myself to breathe and headed toward the exit, clutching my bag tightly. But as I reached the elevator, I saw yet another note lying right in front of the doors. At this point, my hands were almost numb, but I couldn't stop myself from picking it up. This one was different, shorter. It said, "I'm closer than you think." I stared at it, feeling a chill spread through my entire body. I didn't dare look around this time. Instead, I darted toward the stairs, taking them two at a time, not caring about the echo of my footsteps in the stairwell. I could feel my pulse hammering as I ran, almost sure I could hear someone's steps behind me, though I was too terrified to check. I burst out into the main lobby, the silence of the empty library even more oppressive now that I was fully alone. The security guard at the entrance was gone, probably doing his round somewhere, and the entire floor was empty. My first thought was to call someone, anyone, but when I checked my phone, the battery was dead. Typical. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down, convincing myself that maybe I just overreacted. Maybe it really was just some sick joke by another student. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. Another piece of paper, right on the edge of the front desk. I didn't want to read it, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. Slowly, I picked it up, my hands shaking so hard the paper crinkled. This one read, "No one's around to help you." That's when I felt a presence behind me, like someone standing close enough that I should have heard their footsteps. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, but I was frozen in place, staring at those words, feeling my skin prickle. When I finally gathered the courage to look over my shoulder, there was nothing there. Just the empty hall, the long stretch of darkness beyond the glass doors, and the overwhelming silence pressing down on me. I bolted out of the library without looking back, my chest tight and my ears straining for any sound of footsteps following me. The campus was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made every rustle of leaves or distant hum of traffic feel deafening. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone emerging from the library doors, but there was nothing, just the faint glow of the building's lights. My dorm wasn't far, maybe a 5-minute walk, but every shadow seemed to stretch and shift as I hurried through the empty pathways. When I finally reached my dorm room and locked the door behind me, I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still trembling as I dumped my bag on the floor. That's when I noticed it. One of the zippers was slightly open. I could have sworn I'd zipped it up before leaving the library. With a sinking feeling, I opened the pocket and found another note, folded neatly and sitting right on top of my books. My vision blurred for a second as I read it. It said, "You forgot to say goodnight." That's when I realized, whoever it was, they hadn't just been watching me in the library. They knew where I lived. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on and sat in the corner of my room, clutching my phone as if it would somehow protect me. Every tiny sound, the creak of the building, the wind outside, the occasional murmur of someone in the hallway, felt amplified. I thought about calling campus security, but what could I even tell them? That someone had left me creepy notes? That I felt like I was being watched? Without proof, it just sounded paranoid, like I was overreacting. So I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for I didn't even know what. The morning eventually came, but the unease didn't fade. I skipped all my classes and stayed in my room, trying to convince myself it was over, that whoever it was had gotten bored and moved on. But then, just as the sun was setting, I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft, deliberate taps. My stomach dropped. I froze, holding my breath, hoping whoever it was would just leave. After a few seconds of silence, I crept to the peephole, my heart pounding so hard I could barely see straight. But when I looked, the hallway was empty. All that was left was a small piece of paper, taped to the door at eye level. It read, "See you soon." I ripped the note off the door and locked myself inside, my mind racing. Whoever this was, they weren't just messing with me. They were making it clear they could get close whenever they wanted. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police crossed my mind, but I kept hesitating. What if they didn't believe me? What if this person was watching right now, just waiting to see my reaction? My curtains were closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there were eyes on me, like I was being studied through the walls. That night, I slept in fits, clutching a baseball bat I found in my closet. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something tapping against my window. It was faint, almost rhythmic, but enough to make my skin crawl. I didn't move at first, hoping it would stop, but it just kept going. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I crept toward the window, keeping low so I wouldn't be visible. My hands shook as I reached for the curtain and yanked it back. There was no one there, just an empty stretch of grass lit by the campus lamps. But on the outside of the glass, pressed flat against it, was another note. It simply said, "Don't look." I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The note had been taped from the outside, which meant they had been there, right outside my room, just moments ago. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grab my phone. I finally called campus security, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what had been happening. To their credit, they took me seriously and said they'd send someone to check it out. I stayed huddled in the corner of my room, clutching the bat, waiting for the knock that would mean help had arrived. When the security guard finally came, he was polite but visibly skeptical as I explained everything. We went outside together, and the note on the window was gone. It had been there, I knew it had been there, but now there wasn't even a trace of tape. He did a quick sweep of the area but found nothing. He said he'd patrol the dorms more frequently and left me with a generic, "Be careful." I felt so drained I didn't even argue. I went back to my room, locked the door, and shoved my desk chair under the knob for good measure. But as I climbed back into bed, trying to convince myself that maybe it was over, I saw it. A final note, sitting on my pillow. It read, "You shouldn't have called them." I stared at the note, frozen, my mind racing. How had it gotten there? I hadn't taken my eyes off the door since the security guard left. The chair was still wedged under the handle, the window locked tight. It didn't make sense. My pulse was pounding, my entire body screaming for me to leave, but where would I even go? If they could get into my room like this, there wasn't anywhere I'd be safe. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal, my breathing ragged as panic set in. I grabbed my bag and shoved a few things inside, deciding I couldn't stay there a second longer. As I reached for the door, my phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me so badly I almost dropped it. It was a text from an unknown number. My stomach dropped as I opened it. The message was simple: running won't help. I don't know what came over me, but I yanked the door open and bolted down the hallway, not caring who saw me or how ridiculous I looked. I just needed to be somewhere, anywhere, with other people. But as I hit the stairwell, I felt it again, that overwhelming sense of being watched. And for the first time, I thought I heard it too. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, one flight above me. I didn't stop. I raced down the stairs as fast as I could, the sound of footsteps above me growing fainter but somehow more deliberate, like they weren't in any hurry to catch me. They just wanted me to know they were there. My breath came in sharp gasps as I hit the lobby, sprinted toward the front door, and practically threw myself outside into the cold night air. The campus was deserted, the silence only broken by the distant hum of streetlights and my own pounding heartbeat. For a second, I just stood there, trying to decide where to go, but my thoughts were too jumbled to make sense of anything. Then I saw it. Across the quad, in the shadow of a large oak tree, there was someone standing there, barely visible in the dim light. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, watching. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to turn and run in the opposite direction. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance as possible between me and them. I cut through an empty parking lot and headed toward the student center, hoping it would be open, but as I reached the doors, I stopped cold. Taped to the glass, right at eye level, was another note. It read, "You can't hide from me." I tore the note off the door without even thinking, my hands trembling so badly I almost ripped it in half. My first instinct was to go inside, but the doors were locked and the lights were off. The student center was closed for the night. I felt completely exposed standing there, with nothing but the shadows and the faint glow of distant streetlights around me. For a second, I debated going back to the dorms, but the thought of returning to that room, to those notes, made my stomach turn. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Across the parking lot, near the row of bike racks, there was a figure standing in the dark. They weren't moving toward me, just standing there, watching. I froze, my mind screaming at me to do something. Run, scream, fight, but my body refused to cooperate. After what felt like an eternity, they finally moved, taking one slow step forward, then another. That was enough to snap me out of it. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty campus, not even sure where I was heading anymore. The only thought in my mind was to get away, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were right behind me, closing the distance with every step. I finally made it to the campus security office, practically throwing myself at the glass door. It was late, and the place was nearly empty, but the officer on duty looked up in alarm as I pounded on the door. He let me in, and I stumbled over my words, trying to explain everything. The notes, the footsteps, the figure in the parking lot. I must have looked like a complete mess, my face pale, my voice shaking, because he immediately called for backup to check the area. As I sat in the small office, trying to catch my breath, I felt a brief sense of relief. At least I wasn't alone anymore. But that relief evaporated when I noticed something on the officer's desk. Among the clutter of papers and reports, there was a small folded note, identical to the ones I'd been receiving. My blood ran cold as I reached for it, my hands trembling. When I opened it, the words made my stomach drop. "You shouldn't have come here." I barely had time to process it before the lights in the office flickered, and then everything went dark. The silence in the dark was deafening. The officer swore under his breath, fumbling for a flashlight while I sat frozen in my chair, clutching the note so tightly it crumpled in my hand. The faint beam of his flashlight swept across the room, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. "Probably just a breaker," he muttered, though his voice sounded more uneasy than reassuring. I wanted to tell him about the note, but my throat felt like it was closing up. The words, "You shouldn't have come here," were burned into my brain, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the office door, like someone had thrown their full weight against it. Both of us jumped. The officer pointed his flashlight toward the door and reached for his radio, but before he could call for help, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, thick and oppressive, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then, slowly, a piece of paper slid under the door. I didn't want to look at it, but the officer picked it up and held it under the light. His face went pale as he read it aloud. "He's already inside." The officer's flashlight darted around the room, illuminating empty chairs, file cabinets, and walls lined with bulletin boards, but no sign of anyone else. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out every other sound. "Stay here," he whispered, though it was clear he was just as terrified as I was. He pulled his baton from his belt and cautiously moved toward the back of the office, disappearing into the shadows of a narrow hallway. I sat there, frozen, my eyes glued to the faint cone of light from his flashlight as it disappeared around the corner. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Then I heard it, a low, muffled thud, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "Officer," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The stillness was suffocating. And then, just behind me, I heard the faint sound of breathing. Slow, steady, right at my ear. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as the breathing grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't my imagination. I could feel the faintest movement of air on the back of my neck. My hands gripped the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles ached, but I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't even blink. It felt like hours before the breathing stopped, and for a brief moment, the room was silent again. Then I felt it, a hand, light and deliberate, pressing down on my shoulder. I screamed and bolted from the chair, knocking it over as I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been before. My heart was hammering in my chest as I backed toward the door, desperate to get out of that office. As I reached for the handle, I saw it, another note, taped to the inside of the glass. My hands shook as I tore it down and unfolded it. The message was short, written in the same familiar handwriting. "You're mine now." That's when I heard footsteps behind me again. Slow, deliberate. And this time, they were getting closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Instead, I wrenched the door open and sprinted into the night, my chest heaving, my legs burning as I pushed myself forward without any clear destination. The campus felt like a maze, every shadow stretching and twisting into something menacing. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, the glow of streetlights making me feel just a little safer. But the terror hadn't faded. It was inside me now, gnawing at every nerve. I looked back toward the campus, half expecting to see someone standing in the distance, but there was nothing, just the empty pathways and the faint silhouette of the library in the distance. For the first time that night, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whoever, or whatever, it was had given up. But as I caught my breath and fumbled for my keys, I noticed something sticking out of my jacket pocket. A final note. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and unfolded it under the streetlight. It read, "This is just the beginning. I haven't been back to campus since."